Hey everybody, and welcome back to the After Effects compositing tutorial. This is going to be the last episode, so thank you very much for sticking with me this far. I really hope that you've picked up something helpful along the way, and if you haven't, then I really hope that you've derived some kind of entertainment value out of this. Now, this last episode is going to be a step that some people call the most important, but I still kind of think that the first step was the most important if I'm being honest. But that's going to be the lighting and the coloring, which is basically going to be the big part of what blends this scene together, what takes these from looking like these very out of place characters on this background to being a little bit more in place. Not to say that they still won't look completely out of place, but it'll at least look like there was effort being put into it, which I think is important. So that's right. This tutorial is going to be about light. And yeah, I did all the other tutorials in the dark exclusively so that I could do that for this one. So I had better options. I just didn't want to use them. Sorry. Let's get into it. Immediately, I am going to start on the shot that's going to take the most work, because then it just means that everything else is downhill. That's how I'm going to do it. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take the two layers that I have here for shot 3, and I'm just going to pre-compose them in their own layer. I'm going to call this one foreground. Maybe I'll call this one shot 3 foreground, just to differentiate it from foreground shot 3. Or maybe I'll say it's like foreground shot 3A. And then now I've got that pre-composed. And by the way, if you have extra like lighting information with the overlay thing, that's not going to work for the foregrounds if you want to pre-compose them. So you might have to do some different layer magic on your own. But and also, I'm going to take the backgrounds and I'm going to pre-compose this. I'm going to take, this is background shot 3A. So this is the background once everything's been applied to it. And now what I'm going to do is I am going to open up a pretty common, hold on, let me just set this to fit. Pretty common effect called Lumetri Color, which is basically After Effects and Premiere's built-in way of doing color correction. Because we're just going to be able to like get this done in broad sweeps using Lumetri. So first I'm going to turn off the foreground so I can just focus on the background and the characters in front. And I'm just going to crank up the exposure. And you can see pretty immediately that this is having a pretty helpful effect on the cohesion. If we turn this off, it's like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But you can also see that this does reduce the contrast somewhat. So maybe I will just crank up the contrast a little bit, or I'll turn the shadows way down and the highlights and the whites a little bit further up. And now we're getting to some place that's a little bit nicer. I think I'll lower the contrast. I want some separation from the background and the foreground, but I'm not sure if I want this much. And then I'm going to go into saturation, and maybe no, I don't want to desaturate it any. I think I'm happy with 100 saturation. And I'm going to scroll ahead to the next background just to check to see if this one's okay. And I think this works for me too. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this tweak that I have for the background, and I am going to apply it to the foreground over here. So just like that. And you can see that that's a bit extreme on this, so maybe I'm going to turn it down. Or maybe I'm just going to actually straight up remove this, because I think it does look pretty good with the... yeah, I think it looks fine without any adjustments being done. I think it kind of emphasizes, especially with the explosion there, how this looks. And the second thing that I'm going to work on is the characters, because I think the characters look fine over here, but once the explosion happens, you can really start to see how divorced they are from this lighting situation because of the shader that I'm ending up using, basically. So I'm going to grab an effect called Lumetri Color, which is basically, I'm sure you know it, it's Adobe's way of giving you color correction tools. And I am going to find the first normal frame, which I think is right here, and I am going to basically just play around with the settings until I find something that I like. You know, maybe I'll turn the contrast up, maybe I'll turn the highlights up. And I'll make this character feel a little bit more at home. I might tint it slightly green to match it with the green background. I might turn the temperature like a little bit cool to do the same as well. Maybe I'll set the white balance. I don't know. I'll just figure it out. And then I'm going to set a keyframe for all of this And as soon as this lighting, we have this big dramatic lighting change, I am just going to adjust for making this character completely like engulfed in light. I'm going to, because like he's standing right next to an explosion. There isn't any reason why he wouldn't be extremely engulfed in light. With the big exception presumably being the fact that there are going to be some shaded areas, but we'll talk about that before long. So now we get this very big shift in how this character is lit. Suddenly the areas that were gray are now like a whitish pink. But we're not getting the like contextual shadows to fill us in on how this character is going to react to being exploded. So what I'm going to do is I am going to go over here to this area. I'm going to add in something called a layer style, and then I'm going to add in an inner shadow. And what an inner shadow does is that is something that we can kind of tweak to go from the angle that's like opposite from where that fire is coming from. So I think, yeah, like 45 degrees is here, and that's something that we can keyframe for each thing. So for example, I'm going to have the opacity just like way up right around here, but I am going to have it basically completely off over here, because I don't want there to be an inner shadow quite at this point. Now at this point, I'm like, yeah, if there isn't a shadow, I'd be like, that's a little weird. Next, I'm going to play with the choke a little bit. So the choke is basically just like, where's the shadow? How's it doing? Is it, doing okay? Does it want like candy? And I'm also going to play with the size. And that is going to give us, I'm also going to give it noise, because I think that noise like really works. I love giving it like 2 or 3 noise, and it's like really subtle. But I'm just going to play with a whole bunch of settings here, basically to try and make this the nicest looking shadow that I can give it. So maybe I'll make the choke a little bit less severe. Maybe I will turn the opacity to be like further up, so we get something like that. And then what happens is we get this really kind of dramatic shift in the lighting, and we can see the shadow that happens with it. And we can play with the angle of the shadow. So in this case, it's at 45 degrees. Actually, it's at 1 and 45 degrees. So let me just change that. It's at 45 degrees. And then at this point, maybe it should actually, shift a little bit in another direction, because he's like flying, and then, there he kind of disappears into the distance. And I might have to animate that disappearance a little bit better. I might not. Doesn't really, we'll see. So now we get a much more interesting kind of palette in regards to how this looks. And I do think that it could be better, so maybe I'll take another Lumetri color, and I might just stack that on top and crank up the exposure or something. Because now I think that the shadow really gives us an interesting thing to play with, and especially once this explosion happens, it's like, whoa, that's a big loud color that might just be happening. Although I think it's a little bit too severe once it starts to tone down, so maybe I'll keyframe the exposure at this point to be a little bit less. I'll say like actually it should probably be back to 0, but only for this shot. And there's a lot of tweaking that you can do with this, and I would recommend tweaking with this kind of stuff, because that's one of the ways that you can get great results is by doing lots of tweaking. I don't think that I'm definitely going to add like a bunch of other effects like a glow and whatnot, but this is just kind of a demonstration. You'll see the full thing once I'm done making it. So now that I've got the dramatic shift in color coming from this character exploding, let's talk about some of the other minor changes that I can make to make this character look a little bit better. So I am going to, first of all, take this one shot of this cat, and I'm going to duplicate it so that now we have 2 of them. Why do we have 2 of them? We'll see. One of the things that I see really often in a lot of anime shows that I watch, especially things like Attack on Titan and whatnot, is a very liberal use of this diffuse effect. And the diffuse effect in After Effects is pretty easily accomplished by just taking a regular layer, duplicating it, and then adding a Gaussian blur or some kind of blur. Gaussian? I don't know how it's supposed to be pronounced. and then setting it on no, it's not multiply, and then setting it on darken. And what that does is it basically softens a lot of the edges around the areas where the edges might not necessarily be so soft. And that's something that you can control with the blur slider. So if you want there to be less diffuse, you can accomplish that relatively easily. And you can see that it just in general gives a much nicer and softer look. And that's a pretty simple thing that you can accomplish just with one thing. Now the other thing, and this is something I have a friend who works on Baby Shark. That's I'm not gonna make fun of him for it because it's a hell of a job. I have a friend who works on some shows at Titmouse, and this is a trick that he taught me, and I'm very grateful for it. And this is in regards to setting mattes, essentially, for like things like highlights and shadows. This is a handy dandy trick that he taught me. Essentially, he makes two duplications of a layer. He will offset one of them to be in like this direction or something along those lines, or whichever direction the light isn't coming from, generally, whatever direction that may be, and then he will set that to have the one beneath it to have an alpha matte to that. And if I turn this layer off, you can see that we're getting basically an exact replica, but it's only in that particular area. And then what you can do is you can throw on all kinds of effects that you might want. So I'm just going to do another lumetri here to this layer, and that will, in essence, make it appear as though there is some kind of shadow. So if I were to turn the exposure down, now we've got a shadow that's pretty effortless. And if you want to make it a little bit more blurry, you can throw a blur onto the thing that you were doing, and suddenly you've got yourself a nice little blur there, and you have a more natural looking shadow. So if we head back to shot 3, you can see that, yeah, okay, that's pretty good. Now, instead of, in this case, instead of a lumetri color, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a hue saturation, which is a nice color correction thing that you can use if you set it to colorize. Basically, you can colorize this area over here just by playing around with the value. Now, in this particular instance, this cat is going to be colorized by the color of the ground, which the sun is shining down. The ground is mostly green, which means that the light bouncing off of him, and in this case, coloring the backside of his shadow, is going to be green. I can turn the lightness down a little bit, and I can turn the saturation down a fair bit to give myself a nice, like, believably green shadow that isn't necessarily so noticeably green, but it is definitely to some extent green, and that kind of helps with the immersion. And that's a pretty handy dandy thing. And then I might take this actually, and I might go into the shot itself and turn up the brightness, because now it's getting a little bit darker. Right, so in here it's pretty dark again, so I would probably just go to both of these Spencers here and throw another lumetri color on them and turn the exposure up by like 1.5 stops. And you can see that's not doing anything because there's the diffuse, so I'll have to do it to both layers before you can see. But there you go. Now we've got ourselves a nice looking Spencer. And you can see that there's a bit of an issue that might arise right around here where the lighting starts to change, where the back, suddenly it doesn't make any sense for the color to be green. So what I'm just going to do is I'm going to go back over here to the colorize, and I am going to set the colorize hue to keyframe, and then I'm going to ask it to set it to like an orange. And I'm also going to keyframe like the bunch of different stuff to make sure that it's like proper. So like the saturation I'll probably keyframe up as well. So yeah, colorize. We'll take the colorize saturation and the colorize lightness, and we'll just kind of go wild with that. And you can do a very similar thing for the highlights. So for an example, right now you can see that the highlights on this are basically just the original colors that we had. So if you want to do the same thing, what you can do is take this and change this to an alpha inverted matte, I believe. And what that'll do is that will set this to just be in the lighter areas. So I can turn the lightness up, and now we get a nice kind of forefront. So maybe I will take up the saturation, and I'll change this to be blue, because that's like, I don't know, skylight. And I'll take the saturation back down to something like that, and I'll take the lightness down, but it won't be by like that much. It'll be like, you know, I don't know, something around there. And then I will go and make sure that this maintains the value. So right here, like, you know, now when it stops being that, maybe I could change these colors to reflect that accordingly. I could say that whatever the, you know, I'll turn the lightness down, I'll turn the saturation down, or yeah, down, and I'll turn the hue to a different color as well, so that we get a nice balance, and this cat isn't just changing into disco colors for no reason. So there you go, there's a nice trick basically for getting good shadows on your characters. Let's do that again as practice, because I think that this particular shot might not be the best example for that kind of thing. So let's try it with this one, with Chloe. So for this instance with Chloe, we've got ourselves our background, and you can see that our background is dark, so we're going to have to copy over the changes that we made here. Have the lumetri color for the background and bring it into shot 2 after we pre-compose shot 2. So we'll say background shot 2A. And now we've got ourselves our characters, and the question becomes, how do we make our characters stand out a little bit more? And the answer is that stuff that I just went over. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Chloe over here, and I am going to make a copy of Chloe, and I am going to offset her. I'm just going to do this first step in here, because I think that that's not a bad place to do it. And then I'll take that, and I'm going to take these three, and I'm just going to pre-compose them. So I'm going to call this one Chloe Shot 2. So now I'm going to go into here, and I'm going to set this to be an alpha matte of that first one, and I am going to, I think I did it in the wrong direction. Give me a second. I'm going to move this down. I'm going to set this to be an alpha matte. Then I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to set this to be an alpha inverted matte, so that we have both our highlight and our shadow. Then I'm going to go to Hue, Saturation, and I'm going to apply this. So I think that the highlights for this should be a nice blue. I will go to Colorize, and I will make it so. I'll say, yeah, something like that is acceptable. And I want the shadows for this to be a nice kind of very subtle green. So I'll hit Colorize, and I'll make it so. And yeah, no, this isn't subtle. You're right. Okay, you got me. But we can make it subtle. So I'm going to grab a Gaussian blur real quick, and I'm going to apply it to my alpha matte so that we get a nice, more blurry background than otherwise. And then I'm going to do the same for the I'm going to do the same for this one, and then I am going to turn the saturation on this way down, like 4 is fine. Maybe I'll turn the lightness down even more. Like, this is pretty subtle. She's already got shadows that are like built into the shader, so she doesn't need that much more, just like a little nudge. And I'm going to do the same for this one. I'm going to turn the saturation way down. I might turn the lightness up a little bit, but that's all that really needs to be done for this shot, I think. And when we come back, we're like, yeah, that looks pretty nice. This is, you know, acceptable to us. Maybe we could go in a little bit harder with the shadow. We can take the lightness and make it like that, but that wouldn't make that much sense in this context, I feel. Like, it doesn't, we don't necessarily need Chloe to be like that. I think it's acceptable for her to be like this. So the last thing that we're going to do is we're going to duplicate that, throw a blur on top of the duplicate, give it a Gaussian, and then go down into the mode and change that into darken, so that we get like a bit of a diffuse with this. And that's like, I know it doesn't look like very much, but I promise, like, this is all going to come together in the final, and it's going to be ridiculous how much this improves. It's basically just a step of doing this for every single shot and tweaking a lot of stuff until everything looks right. And then when it comes back to the main animation, what we do is we just do like color correction on the whole thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just give you a preview of that. It won't look exactly how it looks in the final, because I still have a lot more work to do with the compositing and whatnot. but this is like the big thing, or at least the last big thing that really helps. And that's always going to be like giving it some kind of unifying color scheme. Usually something like turning up the contrast is good, bumping the saturation so that you can make the colors pop, raising the highlights, lowering the shadows, giving it some kind of tint or another kind of tint is pretty good. And there's one last like really big thing that can really take this from nothing to something nice, and that's going to be something called CC Toner, which is a great tool that I use that basically lets you assign a color scheme to an animation or to a video. So in this case, by default, it's like Old West for some reason, which kind of works because we are like Red Dead cowboys. But you can basically use this to, like, I say I want all of the highlights to be a really bright orange or something like that. And these values are all something that you can keyframe, so at this point maybe we can keyframe the values to be something else, maybe we don't have to. But at the end of it, when you have a bunch of effects on it, it's gonna look nice, because you put a lot of effort into something and you gave it a try. Hiya, this is Spencer from the future here to do a bit of a talk. There was actually one thing that I did forget about while I was making this, because I was just kind of like, let's get this over with so I can make something fun. And that is shadows. There is a very particular way to do shadows in, hold on, my shape layer has a stroke and I don't want it to have a stroke. There is a very particular way to do shadows that I think is pretty important to know. So I'm going to grab this completed shot that I have of Chloe, and I'm going to drag it down, and I'm just going to make this into a shadow. How do you make it into a shadow, you ask? Well, that's easy. There are a couple of ways. The way that I really like is using something called CC Power Pin. This is another Peter trick. Thank you, Peter. Now, Power Pin is basically the same thing as Corner Pin, but with more options. So it will project something for you if you're so inclined. So what I'm going to do is I am just going to take this frame and I'm going to stretch it upside down. And I'm going to do my best to like align her feet in the position that I think the feet should be. So somewhere around here. It's never going to be exact. That's kind of one of the things about this kind of thing. There are ways to clean up the results that you get from CC Power Pin. One of the best ones being probably using a mesh warp of some kind, but I think that this is, like, frankly, it's good enough. You're getting free shadow information just by like distorting it and making a fake ground, which I think is pretty cool and fun and good. So once you have something that you're satisfied with, I might actually just make it like a little bit more squat, because to be honest, I don't want the shadow to be all that pronounced. I think that the light is soft, so there's no need for the shadow to be like super long or anything like that. That wouldn't really make much sense in the context of this scene yet. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave it like this, and then as soon as the big explosion happens, I'm going to take the shadow and basically stretch it out really far in the other direction. So it's going to be like this, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this, and this, and I am just going to kind of rocket it to the other side as soon as we get this huge source of light coming our way. So I'm just going to take that, and I'm going to take that, and I'm just going to, like, it'll still sort of be pinned to Chloe's cat, but it will also kind of go off in another direction a little bit, because that's cool. Because that would be what it would physically do if it was a real shadow that's in the scene when this huge, enormous source of light appears. So something like that, and then we get this animation of it. I could be cleaned up. So something like this. Like, a lot of it is just going to be tweaking. But once you have something you're happy with, once you got yourself something and you're like, yep, that's a shadow, what you're going to do, and first I'm going to take off the edge rays because I don't want the things to have edge rays. What you're going to do is you're going to go into hue saturation, and I think hue saturation works fine. And you're going to turn the lightness all the way down, something like that. You could also make it like a shadowed the color of the ground, up to you really. I'm just going to turn it all the way down because I want it to be all the way down. And then you're going to grab a Gaussian blur, Gaussian, whatever you're supposed to freaking call it, and you're going to blur it to high heaven. And then you can play with the opacity and the blending mode basically to make it as shadow-like as you want. So I like the way that it starts out. It puts a shadow beneath her paws. It gives her some context within the scene that we wouldn't necessarily get otherwise. And then it adds is like this extra bit of production that happens when we have the big explosion. So yeah, that's shadows real quick. Anyways, back to compositing. That's basically all that I've got for this particular portion of the tutorial. I'm going to finish this up on my own and kind of show you what the end result looks like with all of the fancy glow effects and color grading and stuff that I'm doing, but all of the techniques that I am using there is stuff that you could learn by doing this and having a lot of practice. Like, it all just comes down to having good fundamentals at the end of the day. So I hope that you've learned something, and thank you very much for sticking with me. Thanks for sticking around, and I'll see you on the flip side with the next content, whatever it is that I make. Bye. I only have one left.
Oh, yeah, maybe you shouldn't waste it.
No, I'll throw it on the ground.
Okay.
And then I'll, like, stand on top of it. Oh, okay, that was excellent. So you're fine, I die?
Yeah, I'm completely fine. That did not work in the way that I thought.
We found the limit to friendly fire. That's good.
Yourself.
Now we know how it works. I only have one left.
Oh, yeah, maybe you shouldn't waste it.
No, I'll throw it on the ground.
Okay.
And then I'll, like, stand on top of it. Oh, okay, that was excellent. So you're fine, I die?
Yeah, I'm completely fine. That did not work in the way that I thought.
We found the limit to friendly fire. That's good.
Yourself.
Now we know how it works. I only have one left.
Oh, yeah, maybe you shouldn't waste it.
No, I'll throw it on the ground.
Okay.
And then I'll, like, stand on top of it. Oh, okay, that was excellent. So you're fine, I die?
Yeah, I'm completely fine. That did not work in the way that I thought.
We found the limit to friendly fire. That's good.
Yourself.
Now we know how it works.